You are live.
Welcome to the Annapolis Transportation Board, 18 April 2022 meeting. It's good to have everybody here on this cold, rainy night, perhaps the last cold night of the winter and spring. We'll see.
So positive.
Yes. All right, I will plunge straight into the agenda. We have a guest speaker tonight. I do not see him yet, Bill Reichart.
He was in the attendee room. I'll promote him now if you like.
All right. While you're doing that, Tara Ashmore is taking attendance and notes, and I think you can do that by simply looking at the screen. So we can skip over that. Is there a motion to approve the agenda for this evening or any proposed modifications?
So moved.
Discussion? Vote. All in favor? Aye. The agenda is approved. The March minutes were distributed to all of you. Thank you for preparing them, Tara. And they've been distributed. I'll take a motion to approve the minutes as submitted.
So moved.
So move.
Second.
Second.
Okay. And is there a discussion? Hearing no discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. The minutes are approved. There is no public participation registered for this meeting through the website. And so we can move immediately to our guest speaker. And I'd like to welcome Bill Reichart from the Maritime Republic to speak to us about an item of legislation that we will be talking about later in tonight's meeting. That's 0922, off-street parking requirements. Which some of us have read. The board at large has not spoken on the subject, but we'd very much like to get your point of view as we consider this going forward. I understand the legislation is postponed for the time being. Is that your understanding, Bill?
It is, and thank you for inviting me. I very much appreciate meeting with you this evening. Yes, our understanding is that 0922 has been postponed by the City Council for consideration. And as we'll discuss maybe this evening, the resolution R2222 was an interim step, I guess is one way to describe it, which was passed in the last council meeting with a provision to address a study, essentially, within 60 days. My understanding, or the latest information that we have, is that there may be an amendment even to R2222 to extend that study time to 6 months as opposed to 60 days.
Bill, is it true that that resolution centered only on a study which would precede taking up the ordinance itself? That's
correct. I mean, that's our understanding, right. That prior to taking up 0922, the study as described in R2222 would take place and be reported out before the ordinance was to be considered. So at least that's my understanding at this point. And we'll wait to see. We'll wait to see if that amendment to 6 months is adopted in the next City Council meeting, but we anticipate that it will.
Okay, well, the floor is yours to give us your thoughts on 0922 as presently cast. It may change between now and when the council again considers it, but we'd very much appreciate your perspective.
Well, I appreciate that. And, you know, talking about all the ins and outs of 0922, could take a long time. I won't take a long time, I promise you. Because the more we look at it and the more we consider it, at least from the standpoint of the effect, the potential effect on Eastport, is all of the potential for impact, not only on the citizens and the current parking regimen in Eastport, but also the effect on businesses. And I'll talk a little bit about that, or at least the potential for that. What I'd like to do is just back up a little bit before we talk specifically about 0922 and tell you what's happening in Eastport, and a little bit about our background in terms of dealing generally with transportation and mobility issues here on the peninsula. We have been interested in this project, or this problem, or the series of problems regarding mobility and transportation for some time. Going back a few years, actually now almost 3 years, I participated along with other members of the Eastport Civic Association in the Forest Drive Eastport Sector Study Task Force. And I don't know how many of you know about the formation of that task force, but it was formed, I think initially, we formed it in 2018. And the Planning Commission and the City Council commissioned what was called the Forest Drive Sector Study. And that sector study was to look at issues related to transportation, mobility, and development along the Forest Drive corridor, first of all. And then added to that was the same considerations as it related to the Eastport Peninsula. So it became the Forest Drive Eastport Sector Study and Task Force. That sector study, although adopted unanimously by the Planning Commission, was not adopted by the City Council. The Eastport Civic Association, along with others, opposed the adoption of that initial sector study because we found it to be incomplete. And incomplete specifically as it related to issues regarding transportation, traffic management, and mobility. The sector study was supposed to be, and still is, supposed to be essentially a foundation or informative of what eventually would be the comprehensive plan, which is still in development, although we expect a draft of that soon. So in opposition to the adoption of the initial sector study, the City Council unanimously agreed that there were still other things to look at and that the sector study was incomplete. And so a resolution was issued in 2018 to form a task force. And for the very first time, we understand, a task force was established that incorporated government representatives from Anne Arundel County, the state of Maryland, and the city of Annapolis, along with citizen representatives from each of the wards in the city of Annapolis. I was a co-chairman of that task force. And the task force started to meet, and then COVID hit. It delayed our efforts a little bit, but after 2 years of work, we did render a report. And that report has been filed with the City Council. It was filed now almost a year ago, and dealt in large part with issues related to traffic and mobility along the Forest Drive corridor and into the Eastport area, the peninsula. The reason I mention that is because when we talk about things like parking and mobility at least when we talk about it in Eastport, we're looking at it from the standpoint of information and data that has been developed and refined and confirmed over the last 5 to 6 years, even before the task force. We were looking at issues that came out of studies done for traffic and mobility in 2016 in Eastport. And I guess the most recent being the parking study that was done in 2018. Bringing all of that forward, and eventually we'll start talking about 09-22. I'm trying to form a context here because 09-22 doesn't happen in a vacuum, at least as far as we're concerned. And a realistic analysis of its impact and how it will fit or not fit, or how it may be enhanced or changed, at least in our view, requires an understanding of what came before, what people had been saying for literally years in terms of some of the very same issues that people are trying to address through this legislation. Prior to the introduction of 09-22, in fact, as late as literally almost 6 to 8 weeks ago, the Eastport Civic Association, along with the Eastport Business Association, formed a work group. And that work group is the Parking and Mobility Work Group, again, focusing primarily on Eastport. That group has been meeting, and we have been meeting for just about 6 weeks. And we've met with the city, we've met with the people from SP Plus, which you may know are the parking and mobility consultants and company that deals with parking enforcement in Ward 1. And we've been meeting with them because we are aware, certainly, in addition to all the other stressors that have been previously identified in some of the studies that I've just mentioned, we are going to be confronted with the demolition and revitalization of the Hillman Garage and the City Dock area. And the contemplation is that Eastport will have yet another stressor in terms of parking and mobility here on the peninsula. Superimposed on all of that is the push toward extending and making permanent outdoor dining. And that really is the province of R2222 in terms of looking at that study and what's involved in that subject. As far as 09-22 is concerned, in terms of eliminating, essentially what it does is eliminate the requirement for restaurant certification, eliminate the requirement for parking allotments for restaurants as part of that certification. So that will no longer become a planning and zoning criteria. And I think the sense is if that happens, we will then be in a situation that restaurants can get permits for operations primarily on capacity. And other factors yet to be determined, because there will have to be factors. In Eastport, as you know, many of the restaurants are located in the 4th Street, 6th Street area. right across the bridge, essentially within walking distance. And that area for some years, as we know and as we've well documented, have experienced difficulty from our point of view with traffic and parking management already, even when restaurants are required to have parking requirements and parking space requirements in order to be permitted. One factor that we realize, and which is a reality for Eastport, and that is we do not have consistent parking enforcement. Somebody told me the other day, they asked me the question, Bill, did you know that there is a 2-hour parking limit on 4th Street down near the Boatyard restaurant and all up and down 4th Street, all the way down to Davis Pub? And I said, I had no idea about that. Well, it's true. There are a few signs, but as a practical matter, it is not enforced. And the question would be, well, why isn't it enforced? Why hasn't it been enforced? And the answer we have, or the prevailing answer at this point, is that SP Plus, who is responsible for parking enforcement in the city of Annapolis, is not specifically contracted to enforce parking in Eastport. They will come if asked. So, for example, it is true that if a complaint is made because a car is parked out of on a street outside of a private residence for 3 days or 4 days with no apparent owner moving the car, you can call SP Plus and they will tag the car, they will notify the car, they'll come back, and then ultimately they may tow the car. And if there's a specific violation of a tourist bus, for example, parking down on 2nd Street and taking up 4 parking spaces and making it even more difficult to move down that street, if somebody makes a complaint, SP Plus may respond to that. So that's kind of the current status. On to 0922. We think that if the underlying goal of 0922 is to essentially reduce the amount of property that is dedicated to parking. Okay, you'll hear this, that we could make better use of that land. And I think generally, you know, in terms of planning, that's a noble goal. That's something to look at. Other motivations may be simply to make it easier. I mean, a number of our citizens say, well, 0922 is simply a mechanism to make it easier to start up a restaurant and have a lot of people go to your restaurant in Eastport, because the restaurants don't need to maintain parking areas. It leads to the question of, well, what is the responsibility of a business like a restaurant to provide some ability for their clients to park close to where they do business? What is their responsibility? One thing we do know, and that is the elimination of the permit requirement, particularly for any new restaurant developments or even some of the existing ones, is it will put more cars on the street. We really don't know what that impact will be. So one thing we've learned is not to operate on assumptions. We know we have certain problems already with mobility. We certainly have problems with enforcement. We know, for example, and I'll just tell you that recently the ECA, we have discovered the software called SurveyMonkey, and we are trying to refine that a little bit, the use of that anyway, to address issues regarding planning and mobility and transportation and so forth. And recently, within the last several months, we did a survey. I'm going to call it a questionnaire, because when we call it a survey, it's informal. But we developed a number of questions that we put out to our membership and to other people in Eastport and the surrounding area outside of our membership. The ECA right now has over 650 members. But we sent this out to probably over 700 people, and we got over 225 responses. And this was done just within the last couple of months. And we had in that questionnaire questions regarding parking and mobility. And it was very interesting. The reason I mention this is we found a mechanism to kind of tap at least public perception to some degree of the problem. What are the problems that our citizens are seeing in their communities, and what weight are they giving to those kinds of problems? So we learned a couple of things. We learned that well over 60% of the people who responded said that in Eastport, there is a parking problem and there is a mobility problem, mobility defined as being able to get around, impacted by traffic and so forth. They identified, more than a majority identified, that the biggest problem in regard to parking, for example, was on the big weekends and the big, boat show, Blue Angels, those kinds of things. And that presented the most problems for us. Although the majority also said there was a continuing problem. So even though that's where the most problem was, they continued to say, yes, there was a problem generally on the peninsula. In terms of mobility, mobility was defined as the ability to get around. And that could be by walking and bicycling, as well as car and public transportation. A large majority said that they did not use public transportation. And interestingly enough, we asked them, if public transportation were free, would you use it regularly? And the overwhelming majority said no, they would not, which I thought was an interesting response. It's like, but that leads to other questions for us. I mean, it leads to, well, what's the real issue? Is the issue the cost? Or is it the issue that you really can't get to where you're going easily and efficiently through the use of public transportation? So there's a lot of ways to look. You don't take that kind of answer on face value. On the issue of parking, and again, I'm going to tie this back into 0922. 0922 looks at the elimination of a requirement for businesses.
That would
And
be
what-
for new, do I understand correctly that it would operate principally on new businesses as they apply for permits to construct and operate? Would it have any effect on existing businesses?
We think it will. We think as drafted, it could. It could. The question there is, and I think it's an unanswered question as to whether there would be a retroactive application. And I think that's an unanswered question right now. Some of the tie-ins to that are when people are looking at the potential for let's talk about new businesses. Let me just limit it to that for a minute. You know, of course, that in Eastport we have maritime districts. And we have a concern that looking at the fact that we already have parking and mobility problems on the peninsula, the ability for businesses to not have any parking requirements or responsibility for parking requirement would potentially promote more businesses showing up, more people coming into the peninsula that just can't find parking. And what will that do? And what effects would that have from our perspective in the maritime districts particularly? As part of a response from this, things that our work group are starting to look at are not only working with the city in terms of solving the problems that we know have existed for some time. So for example, signage and enforcement. Even enforcement of our existing regulations is something that if we did it today, we would probably, if we started today to enforce our existing regulations, there would be impact. And being completely honest about it, we don't know what the impact would be. We don't know the degree to which an impact, assuming it's a positive result for increased volume of automobiles or increased parking stresses. We don't know that if you just enforced what you already have, what would that do for that problem? So that's a threshold question for us. If we've said to the city, and the work group is looking at this again, but we have said to the city, look at what was filed in 2018. And if you just did the top 6 recommendations, would you see improvement? Even with the additional stressors? And that's an unanswered question, but my suspicion is you would. You would see some improvements. There's discussion about, and serious discussion about the potential for parking zones, the application of parking zones in Eastport. That's a very controversial subject. There is no, I don't pretend to know any majority or minority view on that, frankly. And that has the real potential for unintended consequences. By zones, I mean, we would not have parking meters. The technology has advanced to the point where We're in discussions with the city and with AP Plus, for example, and looking at different mobile applications which can be used in defined zones to address certain kinds of mobility and parking problems. But before we go there, the question really before the work group is, do we start there, or do we start with what we have asked for years in terms of, as I've said, enforcement and improvements? And I'll just give you an example of one of that. You know, there is public parking in Eastport. There are public, well, there's one over near City Marina. There's a lot that's open to the public. And part of the recommendation a couple of years ago was to put a sign up directing the public to that lot. It's a paid lot, but it has a number of spaces. It has a significant number of spaces, and it is totally underutilized because people just don't know about it. So it's a signage issue. And the city did put some signage up. So that was a type of recommendation. You know, other types of legislation that was talked about in the earlier recommendations, going back years, was to look at legislation that would more easily allow churches and private property owners to lease or use some of their space for parking legitimately during, you know, either big events or other times, and use it as kind of an income source. You see this, for example, at the Eastport Elementary School. The PTA does a fundraising activity by parking automobiles during the boat show. Our understanding is that you know, that kind of an arrangement on a more ongoing basis is actually prohibited by code to some extent. Certainly for churches to do that on any, for example, to do that on a long-term basis. So legislative adjustments in that arena should be explored. And the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because I just want to share with you that although we were going to talk about 0922 tonight, you know, it expands out into terms of what are we trying to do? Why are we trying to do it? What's the motivation for it? What are the intended and unintended consequences? And if we're trying to solve problems, are there things that we could be doing short of that kind of legislation that would also have an impact that we should know about before going to such things as 0922? If 0922 promotes a push, it pushes cars into the street. As a very practical matter, unless there is some improved parking enforcement, at least in Eastport, we will just have more cars looking for parking spaces and more parking down the peninsula, and you know, trying to figure out, well, what's the scope of the problem? That really is, how far do you want to walk to where you want to go? You know, what is the outer limit of that?
Bill, let me ask a question, if you don't mind the interruption. You mentioned an underutilized paid lot, and the question is, why is it underutilized? Is it underutilized because it's unnecessary? Is it underutilized because the barrier of price keeps people from using it since free parking is available on the street?
Yeah.
Is it underutilized because people don't know that it's there? All three of those things could be operating, but and you don't have to answer the question, but those are considerations. And one wonders if you look at 922 and its effect of, as you say, pushing more cars onto the streets and thereby increasing stresses, if the kinds of changes that you have suggested, making those paid lots more visible and easier to operate by the people who own the spaces, would some kind of natural equilibrium somehow be established as the pressures accumulate and as relief points are identified?
It could be. And I guess really what we're saying, Kurt, is in response to your observation that, well, let's say with the paid lot on Severn Avenue, near the city marina, that people don't know that much about. There was really no signage, no effective signage for that lot. So the assumption was people didn't know about it. And just anecdotally, a lot of people didn't know about it. However, I think it's an extremely valid point to say, well, we don't know, is it people didn't know about it and didn't use it, or they didn't use it because they didn't have to, because they found free parking just 3 blocks away and they were willing to walk 3 blocks rather than, pay a few bucks to walk 1 block, or all of those factors. We just really don't know that. But I think in terms of reaching an equilibrium, let me address that for a minute. And I just share an idea with you, and that is, if you want to reach an equilibrium, doesn't it make sense to at least enforce and utilize everything you've already got first? And that becomes your baseline, hypothetically. And then see what kind of problem you have. And I think that's a legitimate question. The kinds of improvements, looking at, and I don't want to be glib about this because I think there are real issues involved, but people have suggested, for example, in Eastport, we've got some narrow streets here that are 2-way streets. And anybody who's driven in Eastport knows about, the Eastport high five that you do with your rear view mirrors, trying to get through our streets sometimes. But some people have suggested, well, look, can we make some of those more 1-way streets? Can we rearrange some of the traffic pattern to make it a little easier to flow and so forth? Can we use, those kinds of mechanisms and others which have been identified for years as potential remedies more easily and create a baseline that makes some sense and then go from there. But it depends on what problem you're trying to solve. If you're trying to relieve the obligation of businesses to provide parking, if that's the motivation, that's a different motivation. I mean, that's making it easier for businesses to operate, arguably, than to resolve parking and mobility issues. Putting in place shuttles identifying locations that already exist as parking hubs, if you can. We have few of those in Eastport. We don't have parking garages in Eastport. But we can use shuttles to help people move around. We can improve bike lanes to help people move around safely. So there are a lot of other things to do. What I'd like to do is just really address your concerns and questions, or anything that you'd like to know about what we're doing or how we're doing it, and just open it up now for questions, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'd love to have other members of the board, and we have Karma O'Neill, who is on the city council here as well. And so I will turn over the floor to those who might want to say something. Before you do that, I do have one observation, Bill. What we're talking about fundamentally is a public resource, which is scarce and has multiple competitors to use it. Am I incorrect when I say that the primary constituency of your association is residents rather than businesses? And therefore you are, I guess, overrepresented in your interests for residents rather than those who operate businesses?
Yes, well, it's the Eastport Civic Association, okay? And Eastport also has the Eastport Business Association. And there are members of the Business Association that are members of the Civic Association and vice versa. I mean, have dual membership. But yes, I think it's fair to say that, you know, the Eastport Civic Association, primarily the membership is composed of citizens, and our catchment area, if you will, goes up and down the peninsula all the way into Ward 6, down into Tyler Avenue area would be the kind of outer limits. So our membership and our catchment area for the association is all of Ward 8 and part of Ward 6.
Has the business association weighed in on this matter?
Well, the business association, as I mentioned, Mike Tomasini, I don't know if you know Mike. Mike is the president of the Eastport Business Association. And when I talked about the formation of this work group, it was myself and Mike Tomasini, and actually a number of other members of the Business Association, together with a few members of our board, that actually formed that work group. We sat down and said, look, this is coming. And it's going to affect everybody. And it's certainly going to affect businesses. So we can wait for people across Spa Creek to tell us what to do and how to do it. Or we can start using our resources and our experience and start being players in this conversation and get busy. So I just want to say that the Eastport Business Association has been extremely active in this. And I don't see two experiences, at least I've had in the last 4 years. One with that task force where we sat down and we were told it was for the first time, the task force, Forest Drive Task Force, first time that city planners, county planners, state planners, citizens from all of the wards actually sat down at the table and addressed the same mobility, traffic, and development issues together. At the time, Sally Nash was the director of planning and zoning, was on that task force. And I mention this because I want to tell you that experience was extremely helpful. Just to get the people to sit down with the expertise and the input, citizens and planners, government and community, looking at the same problem, different perspectives, same objectives to try to help. People listen to each other, learn from each other. And I think a decent product came out of that, which has been filed with the city. I think the same thing is happening with this work group in Eastport, much smaller scale. But we're not finding a dichotomy of interest between the business association and the citizens association.
That's very interesting.
You know,
I'd really like to get questions and observations from the rest of those attending, and I'll just stop with one thing. It does occur to me that the interests of the various wards may vary significantly.
Yes.
And the constraints that they face are quite different. My strong impression is that in Ward 2, for example, we are abundantly endowed with parking. And so the kinds of pressures that you face mostly do not afflict us. And but it varies around the city. You just have different problems in different places.
That's
so a challenge is to cast the ordinance in terms that will, in some sense, be applicable citywide. Anybody else that would like to make comments or questions?
I have a question for Bill. I had recently heard about a study. It almost sounds like it could be your Forest Drive study that John Alt, the architect at ABS, had worked on. Was he on this 2018?
He may have been on the 2018. Well, there are two things. In 2018, Alderman Ross Arnett commissioned, just for Eastport parking study, and that involved, and I was not involved with that, but he may have been. He may have been. And that study was conducted over about a year and involved both business people, maritime people, and citizens in Eastport. And that report was filed with the city in late 2018. And we can provide a copy of that to you if you'd like. Maybe, Kurt, I could send that to you or somehow.
Thank you.
So that you could distribute it. Anyway, that's one study. The Forest Drive Eastport Sector Study Task Force was much broader than that. And that report was filed with this, that was started in 2018, met for 2 years over COVID, and we filed our final report with the city in about a year ago. It was April of 2020. We filed that report. And that, I don't want to go too far down that road, but that report, we worked very closely with the City of Annapolis Planning and Zoning Department, and you will see some of the ideas actually and some of the recommendations of that report we believe are going to be incorporated. We think they are going to be incorporated in the comprehensive plan draft that will come out fairly shortly. But those are two different things.
David DeQuincio has a hand up.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Kurt. So Bill, good evening. Thanks for
Hi, David.
sharing your insights. I'm a fellow Eastporter. I live on 2nd Street near Chester. And my wife and I operate a business. Mike is one of our customers, Mike Donacini.
Yep.
And I am wondering what did this group, does this group, or did it start with a set of baseline assumptions about how you go about this kind of situation. And also, by the way, I was on the Planning Commission at the time when that sector study was undertaken.
Right.
And I recall the backlash against it. I didn't quite get why that backlash came to be. I personally felt that that sector study put forward a viable departure from kind of an old way of thinking, or what I believe is becoming an old way of thinking about these kinds of things. But I'm pleased to hear that there's consideration about how new technology can help. I have long been trying to prod anyone who would listen toward thinking about a parking app, or how we could get real-time information. I mean, this is for the city at large, not just Eastport. And I've always observed that if people had better real-time information about where a parking spot actually is, and there was a way they could book it or reserve it or something. I'm glad to hear I'm not the only one thinking along those lines. But I do wonder if how well this group represents everyone here in Eastport. It seems like a lot of the public participation and a lot of the boards and commissions and these working groups are made up of people that have the time to participate in them, and therefore the parents with young kids, or people who have long commutes, and just really would struggle to find the time to participate, like their views are not necessarily taken into consideration. So I'm interested in hearing that, if you have any comment on that.
I
And
do.
Also,
Yeah.
and also, I am concerned, and I don't want to put you in a box here, but I would like to hear your thoughts, that, one of the things that I noticed on Planning Commission, in my time on the commission, is that level of service is often trotted out as a basis for opposing a project. And it seems to me that not everyone here in Annapolis is aware that level of service is becoming an obsolete idea. It's mainly because it doesn't measure access and connectivity. It puts all the eggs in the basket of how fast cars are moving. And it just doesn't work in cities. So one of my concerns is, are we too wedded to LOS?
Mhm.
And
Well, let me, yeah, I
I'll
hear
stop
you.
there. Yeah, I'll shut up. Thanks.
No, I hear you. I got two things. Let me start with, a work group. If the question is maybe a concern that the work group doesn't represent, or what is the constituency of the work group, or do these work groups, are they comprised of people who kind of have the time and the energy and to do this, but are not reaching the people who do the commuting into DC and Baltimore and have young kids at home? And, from my perspective also, are we reaching the people down in Haka, in public housing? We live in an extremely diverse community, as you know, where we have the super rich sailors on one end of the peninsula, and we've got some very challenged communities a mile away, okay, that can't get to a grocery store easily on public transportation. And so those are challenges which, frankly, from my point of view, are pretty exciting to deal with, actually, you know, but we've got to keep all of that in mind. So let me deal with that diversity issue. As far as the work group is concerned, we are concerned about that. And you know, I think we have a diverse group in the work group. We have an equal number from the EBA, Business Association, representing a variety of different businesses in Eastport. And we made it a point to include people who live down on President Street, down near the Eastport Terrace, Harbor House area, away from the peninsula, to talk about particularly mobility, the mobility aspects of what we're discussing. So at least as far as the work group is concerned, we made an effort to do that. Now, in terms of reaching people and trying to tap ideas and opinions and so forth, I mentioned to you the questionnaire. It was an initial questionnaire on parking and mobility. So we've got the data for that. We're going to be working on a second, well, let me, before I say that, I was concerned that we reached the Hispanic community, so we had that translated into Spanish. And we're having a little more challenges getting that distributed in the Hispanic community, just because there are different kinds of challenges of doing that. You know, not everybody has a computer. It's just a different way of getting the questionnaire out, but we're working to do that and trying to work with Hispanic groups in really trying anyway, to tap some opinions and input from the community there. And frankly, I think before our job is done, we may actually have to get out and go down and meet with some little small focus groups in different communities and just ask people, you know, about their experiences and do it that way. But I agree with you. I think it is a concern, and we can't be doing these work group and study groups in a vacuum. We need to.
Thank you. I see that Carol Kelly has her hand raised as well. Let me just
deal with LOS in a minute whenever we get to it. I don't want to, yeah.
I just want to point out we're an hour into the meeting already, so I'd like to. We have some other things on the agenda too. Carol, and then anybody else, if you can raise a hand.
Bill, I first of all like to compliment your group on taking the initiative, despite what is at this point apparent, I guess, its lack of diversity. The issues that the group is recognizing and examining and presenting, I think will become and are becoming apparent to a very diverse group of people, people who drive or even walk or take bicycles down Chesapeake and Bay Ridge, and many times of the day will be aware of the problem that's growing regarding mobility and parking and traffic and transit in Eastport. So I applaud you for taking this on as a citizen group, and I'm impressed that you are already communicating and working with the business community. That's important. I've been on the transportation board long enough to watch years of struggle between those two groups, citizens and businesses, in Ward 1. And I'd like to make the point, just because it will become relevant at this point, that what's happened in Ward 1 and what is now happening in Ward 8 will probably happen in Ward 2, Kurt, as things move forward with this town and its growth and its visitation. So what you're doing now with this group is very significant, even if it's done in a compromised way already. The other thing I've observed recently is that there is considerable initiative being taken by the city of Annapolis, not only to deal with problems of transportation in the town, but to create them. In fact, if the mayor's ferry is successful, it will benefit in one way with a relief of congestion and cars, hopefully in the downtown area. But it may do a lot to complicate things in Eastport, where people might park to use that ferry, or where people might go to use the businesses. So it's important to join these people together, the civic community, the business community, and the city of Annapolis at the start. And that may be your call, your mission as a group. I would like to see it as our call as well, the board's call, but I can't personally promise that. So my hat's off to what you're doing, and please keep at it.
Carol, thank you. And let me just mention very briefly, because I haven't yet, I want to compliment the city manager's office in working with us on this. When we formed this work group, the EBA and the ECA, we consulted with David Jarrell about this, and we said, look, we want to do this work group and we need help. We need help from the city. Specifically, we need access to data that they have in their departments. And we need access to SP Plus. And we would like you to understand what we're doing and participate in. And I want to give David specifically a compliment this evening, because he's been very helpful to us, very responsive to us. We asked for and got from him, through him, we wanted a lot of data. We wanted a data dump, basically, to assess need early in this project. And he worked with us and did that. We had an excellent hour-and-a-half briefing with SP Plus. We're trying to set up a second one. So I just want to say to you that that element, and if I'm trying to leave you a message tonight at all, if I could just say one, if I know I ramble, but if there's one thing I could try to get across, it's I'm extremely impressed, frankly, and I am certain that we are better off resolving these problems when business people and citizens who live in this community are working in some kind of direct meaningful partnership with government to solve what we all understand to be the same problems. We may come at them from different areas, expertise. They may have different impacts on where we live, okay? But when you get those people around the table together, meaningful things happen. And the biggest obstacle that I've seen over the last several years is actually getting that. Getting the table, getting people there, identifying the common problems, coming up with realistic solutions, and following through. I know that sounds simple, but when somebody
never is.
Yeah, but we'll provide a table, but
all right. Well, Bill, this has been wonderful. Are there any more comments or questions before we wrap this part of the meeting up? Seeing nothing, I would like to give you my thanks for appearing and expanding our view of the problems that you are facing. And we're very happy to not only hear from you, but to hear that multiple constituencies within Eastport are involved in a complicated process.
They are. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
You bet. Thank you. Moving on in the agenda, the next person is Kwaku. I want to give Alderwoman O'Neill a spot on the agenda. I think you should be on here as an explicit item from now on. And just before Kwaku takes over, I wonder if you have anything to report or questions / tasks that you're interested in having the Transportation Board take up.
Thank you very much, Kurt. I don't really need a lot of time. I'm more here listening because I was really interested in hearing all of the things that you guys are doing. I will say this, the council is in the process of budget discussions. The Finance Committee is meeting with each department this week and next. And I believe that Director Duwa is up tomorrow in front of the council committee. So I'm excited to hear that presentation, and I'll be happy to share back next month all of the things that we're doing as far as the Finance Committee reviewing all of the departments' presentations. As far as transportation, I know that there's a lot of different work groups going on, as Bill had mentioned earlier, as far as from esports and talking about parking, talking about transportation. As you all know, the garage is due to be closing down May 5th now. It's the last date that it's available. And the city is working on the marketing campaign to help people make their way around town, both with circulators. There's a 10-minute circulator, and not wanting to steal from Director Duwa's reports. I won't talk any more about it, but if there's questions that people have about transportation opportunities, once the garage is closed down for renovations, please feel free to reach out, and we will do the best we can to get the most information and most up-to-date information out to everybody. But thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we have the pleasure of hearing from the Transportation Department itself, Dr. Duwa. I like your waterfall. By the way, you're on mute still. You are on mute. Whoops. Kwaku, can you hear me? You are on mute. Yes. Oh, no.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you, Alderwoman O'Neill. Yes, our budget presentation is tomorrow at 10. You may also want to go to the city website to take a look at the mayor's proposed budget. I believe transportation budgets pages are the last few pages that you may want to take a look at it. Overall, the mayor's proposal is about $8 billion for transportation. That includes money for vehicle replacements. Okay. The other thing is that I believe May 2nd, city employees will start parking at the Park Place garage. There was a town hall meeting with the city manager and HR that we did provide some information. So beginning May 2nd, city employees who are currently parking at the Hallmark parking garage will no longer park at that garage. Of course, that is the beginning of the demolition process of Hellman. So they will have to go to park at Park Place. And related to that are various transportation options that Alderwoman O'Neill did mention about. We have the Circulator Service now called Downtown Shuttle. So during the weekdays from 6:30 to about 9:30 and from 3 to about 6 p.m., we do have 2 buses that will be operating on the Circulator route. And outside those time periods, it will be only 1 bus as it is currently. In addition to that, the city actually has contracted VIA to provide on-demand service. Basically, it's driven by an app that you have to download it on your phone or your smart device. And through that, you can request a trip. That service is not for every part of the city. So typically it's zoned out. So based upon your location, the app will be able to determine whether you can request a trip or not. So that is coming. I believe that will be launched sometime in May, and it will be in service for about 14 months. That's during the time of the construction of the Hillman parking garage. And on top of that is the 10-minute trolley. That is the label that the mayor has given to this type of service, using the battery electric golf-like vehicles that will be looping around the downtown area, around the city dock area, to basically move people back and forth. So that is all that I have in terms of updates. So if there is any question for me, I'll be very glad to answer.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. I haven't seen your monthly reports for a while. If you can send that around, that would, they're still being produced, right?
They are. We are late by about 2 months because of shortage of staff.
Okay.
The director's position is still vacant. We have about 3 vacant positions in administration, so it's been very difficult to catch up with those, in addition to the grant preparation.
I
and
understand.
Also,
money comes first.
Yeah, so, but
right.
you will get them as we move along.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much. Now we're into reports from committees. The first one has to do with electric vehicles. By the way, Elvia moved out of the city. She's a short distance outside of the city, and so we have moved her from representing a ward to an at-large position. Unfortunately, she's not here tonight. Tom, do you have anything on this area? Is Tom here? Thought he was earlier. Yes.
Kurt, even an at-large position can be outside the city.
Yeah, that's what I said.
I know.
That's where she is.
That's not the point.
Oh.
Any city board or commission that I know of, you have to live in the city or be a business person. If it has business people on, she could. If there's business people, she could maybe represent her business, which is in the city, but
she is a member of the board.
That I don't know, that something changed I don't know about?
At-large positions do not have to be city residents.
That's a change. I don't know when they
no.
changed it. But
no, it's been in the ordinance for some time.
It's a change from before. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Beth, that's why I'm still here. So it changed before I moved to parole. I'm at large.
Yeah. So we don't have Tom here. I'm sorry. We'll have to just postpone this until next month. Fare free transit discussions continue widely here. The county has gotten into the act. The chairperson of the county council, Lisa Rodvian, wrote a nice letter to, I guess, the mayor and members of the city council, saying that they had looked at it, intend to move in the direction of, well, it's already fare free in the county. They're going to move to make it permanent, and are preparing a budget for the county, which will have this explicitly in the budget so that it can become a permanent feature of Anne Arundel County Transit. And in that letter, there was encouragement to the city to move in the same direction so that our two systems, which overlap and are closely related, would be seamless for passengers who sometimes use systems or buses in both systems. So that's where we are. And I guess the members of the subcommittee, the 3 of us, are continuing discussions with members of the city council and the mayor. And that's all I have to report on that particular topic. Anything else on fare-free transit that anybody would like to say? If not, I'll move on to the next.
I met with Karma, and
oh, yes.
yes, and we had a very, very good discussion about her concerns about fare free, and just what it means to the city, and not to the city residents, but to the city budget and how things would be paid for and things like that. And I've also got a request into Sheila and Rhonda, but I haven't set anything up yet.
Okay. One other item, the Caucus of African American Leaders also passed a resolution endorsing fare free transit. I haven't seen the actual wording of that resolution yet, but when I get my hands on it, I will just distribute it widely. Have you seen that, Karma? Okay. We will distribute that among everybody who is here tonight. Next is legislation.
I just did want to ask one question, and it's probably something I should have known the answer to a long time ago with regard to fare free. My wife has been helping the Boys and Girls Club with their Youth of the Year promotion, which is tomorrow night. So if you want to, please reach out to me or Google it. It's going to be a really cool event. But the question came from them, and I didn't know the answer, is what would it take to add routes that would support between the school and Boys and Girls Club if we did move to a fare-free model?
I don't know. Kwaku may have a better answer to that. I consider these two issues as separate, distinct, and able to be pursued in parallel. Every transit system ought to periodically undergo an analysis and revision of its route system and its schedule. And I know that the Transportation Department has been doing that regularly. I think there's strong feeling that it needs to be done again. And to the extent that we can find resources to support an expansion of the system and an improvement of the system, we should do so.
I'll reach out separately then.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes. First of all, for all students in Annapolis, I think up to grade 12, they do ride the bus for free. Talking about looking at the entire route system, I think it's due for an update beginning FY 2024. Typically, we do apply for grants for that kind of planning study. It takes a look at your socioeconomic data, incomes, determine where the transit-dependent population are. So based upon the limited resources, the focus is to serve the majority of the transit-dependent population. So we do get grants through our normal grant application, and M.MTA has some legal consulting services that we normally will use. For that, typically when it happens, we do have what is called Public Advisory Committee. The last time we have two members of the then Transportation Board being members of the Public Advisory Committee. They actually advise or work with the consultant. We, the staff, provide any data requests that will come from us. So we don't make any recommendations, but we do provide the data for that thing. So FY 2024, we will request grant fund for that. And depending upon how soon we can get a consultant, we will begin later that fiscal year. So that is coming, and I look forward to that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
A personal observation, not necessarily shared widely, is that this is very important. Route tweaking, redesign, and so forth is something that we all feel is important. We'd like to see expansions where we can find funds to support them as well. The regular rhythm has this occurring in FY 24, which is some time from now. And we have all recommended with some vigor and enthusiasm that the city adopt the fare-free portion of our recommendations, because that's something that we can do right now at very low cost. And that's, I guess, all I need to say about that.
Could I address that?
Yeah.
Okay. one of the things I learned with all the interviews that I did with cities around the country that have gone fare free is a couple of them did their route changes at the same time that they did fare free. And they said it really was complicated to do it that way, and they wish they hadn't. However, they all said that because of fare free and the changes in the ridership and how riders were riding and everything, that within, say, 3 months or 6 months, that they did surveys and started doing their route adjustments. And some of those adjustments were where they just, by having shorter headways, they were able to simply expand the same route a little further or into another place or whatever. And they all said that none of them that I talked to required more rolling stock or more staff to have the increased service that they were providing because of the fare free transit.
That's really an interesting point. When fare free goes in, there will be changes, there will be response, and we've seen responses from 25 to 50% in increased ridership. That ridership is not going to increase uniformly across the city. It will increase more strongly in some parts of the city than in others. We heard tonight, for example, from Bill Reichart, that Eastport, a very affluent and compact place, may respond less vigorously than perhaps Forest Drive and other areas of the city where people are more dependent on transit than they are in Eastport. So the response itself will require route design that is different than it would be if there were no fare free.
Yes. But I have a feeling there's areas in Eastport that I think would require, end up riding more. They just aren't the ones that they're asking.
That's true.
You know, and
That's true.
So anyway, that's beside the point. So those are the things we learned, and I've talked to quite a few, and it was amazing that almost all the answers to every question was basically the same from every city that I talked to.
Thank you. Next item, legislation is 0922, which we've already talked about in some degree. Beth, you and John and perhaps somebody else were working on this. Do you have anything at this point?
No.
Maybe it's too early.
Yeah, no, because we didn't do anything because it got shelved.
Okay.
The city ended up shelving it, but now we know because they're going to do a study.
Yeah.
But we didn't know why they did. So we didn't do anything with it.
Okay. Well, we will circle around to that. We're now at a point in the agenda where we can go around the table with any comment that you would like to make. We have 7 minutes yet to do this. Tara?
So I just want to ask this group, I did ask the same question to Bill, but I was out the other night and someone mentioned John Alt, the architect with ABS, having done a broad study of transportation and mobility. And I just was wondering if any of you knew what this person could have been talking about, and if you are aware what it could, I mean, it really could go back some time. They were not specific.
Tara, I know a little bit about it. Not much detail, but what I do remember of it is that it was quite forward-looking, and I'm just trying to recall this from memory. I never saw it documented, but one of the ideas he was exploring, he was very early in exploring this idea, and one that I think has a lot of merit, is the concept of the small autonomous shuttle. And I think in his concept, he was thinking something 8 to 10 seat autonomous or semi-autonomous vehicles. There are in development pretty far along examples of 6-seat vehicles, companies working on 6-seat autonomous vehicles that you summon with an app that have security cameras and route optimization, so the algorithm crunches all the requests and where people want to go, et cetera, and optimizes the deployment. And the reason that stuck in my head was I don't know how many of you remember a couple of years ago when a professor, his first name was Tim, and I can't remember his surname, from one of the universities in Florida, gave an autonomous vehicle presentation at the Maryland Arts Center. Kurt, you may have remembered that, right? Weren't you there?
I don't remember that one.
Anyway, he was singing the praises of how, autonomous vehicles were going to be very good for cities, and I didn't agree necessarily because I think he was overlooking the key problem, and his presentation was autonomous cars, and how autonomous cars. Yeah, I think he was not seeing the whole picture, in that the core problem with cars isn't that we have to drive them in cities. I mean, that's part of the problem, but the core problem with cars is they're too large and they take up too much space for the mobility they deliver.
So multi-passenger is the way to go.
Right, and if you look at, so Amazon is working on one. There was one called Olli, OLLI. What is, and the Amazon one is called Zoox, ZOOX or something like that. But what's interesting about these things is they are very compact. They take up very little space.
Elon Musk's
John. So the point being that John Alt was barking up that tree long before a lot of other people were. So I'll shut up.
Elon Musk's Tesla Corporation has announced that they are going to be producing such an autonomous vehicle. And I think it's on the order of 10 passengers or so. It'll be on the chassis of the Cybertruck. And it looks like 3 years from now. So there's some lead time.
Okay, so it clearly predated all of us, was not really part of us. Okay, but that's helpful. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay. Next on the list is Zoe Johnson.
I don't have any updates tonight, Kurt. There are a lot of projects underway, kind of that I'm tracking and hoping to see some progress here on the future, including the bike path projects and the city's analysis to look at intelligent transportation signals and the signalization network within the city that can help with congestion and evacuation response planning. So there is a transportation working group. Kurt, I think you're on that as part of that project, and I'm looking forward to the next steps. So Great. I'll be back in touch next meeting with hopefully more information.
Very nice. Do I have this right, that the alumni building is under construction now?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
It's moving right along.
it is. It's like they announced it and started it. There was not much hesitation going on there.
Wow.
Yep, there's a big mound of dirt. Yes.
Yeah.
So.
Beth?
I don't have anything beyond what I've already spoken.
Okay. Charles Brooks, are you still with us? Yes, you are. Charles, are you within earshot? He may be away. Kara Flewinski is not attending tonight. She sent me a note.
Sorry, had a
Oh, yeah,
issue
Charles?
Talking about autonomous vehicles, I saw an article a few weeks ago about an autonomous vehicle that got pulled over in San Francisco.
Yeah,
I saw
and it
that.
didn't have
Drove
anybody
itself
in it.
to a
They didn't
safe
know what to
spot.
do.
literally drove itself to a safe spot during the traffic stop. But the company that runs those vehicles actually uses them for city workers.
Ah,
Just a little food for thought for here.
yeah.
That's all I've got.
All right, thank you. Carol Flowinski is not here tonight. She sent me a note that you should be aware of. The current status of COVID in our country and in our town has abated restrictions to the point where she is now performing more vigorously. You know, she's a harpist, a concert harpist. And she now finds herself being called on to perform frequently enough that she is running out of time to devote to this transportation board. And so we may have to find a replacement for Ward 7. David?
I do have a couple of things worth noting in terms of developments and things that you may not all know about. We had a good, what I consider some good outcomes from the legislative session that just wrapped up. I was particularly happy that the state legislature overrode the governor's veto of a package of rail improvements. Of course, you know, if it's rail, you can count on our governor to poo-poo it. He can always find money for pavement, but God forbid, you know, God forbid we fund rail. But our delegates and senators held the line on that, and that's good news. I do have a couple of personal data points that I think might help as you're turning over in your head what Bill Reichart was saying about the situation, you know, things here in Annapolis. A couple of things that I hear. This is somewhat anecdotal, but a key reason that some Eastport residents are unenthusiastic about transit is safety, that there's a perception, I'm not saying a reality, but a perception that that it's not safe. I think that is just assumptions and not reality. And so there would have to be some kind of campaign, some public relations work done to counter that perception. Also, I think it's important to note that different businesses here in Eastport have very different situations in terms of their needs for parking. So I don't know how many of you know this, but Mike Tomasini and his wife Emily own and operate Pirate Adventures. And that is a parking and vehicle dependent business. I mean, they could try to sell tickets to participate in you know, for 6 and 7 year olds to participate online on a trip, you know, out on the pirate ship, but that's not going to work. I mean, their whole business is experiential. Being there is really important for the kids, right? And so sometimes they have different school groups or boys and girls clubs kinds of things. So they have buses that come in and bring, you know, big groups of kids in. And so their needs, of course, need to be accommodated, and it generally seems to work. And then there are other business, of course, you can't eat online. So of course, restaurants do need people physically present, and that of course means cars. But then there are businesses, our business, for example, that my wife and I operate. We have a lot of customers we never meet in person. They order equipment from us and we ship, or in some cases, we even have, if it's a large shipment, we arrange for it to be drop shipped from our distributor up in Jersey. So often we never even see it. And then local customers will come and pick up equipment, but today I had something rare at the office where I had 2 customers taking up 2 parking spaces in the lot that we share with Canoe and Kayak. That hardly ever happens. So so different businesses have different intensities in terms of how much parking is required, right? And so that's something that I think Bill understands, but it just shows how you have to take into account a lot of little. It's a fine-grained problem, right? And then I wanted to clarify something or give some additional insight into something Bill mentioned. He mentioned a lot that is not well utilized at Annapolis City Marina. The lot he's talking about is one that it's between 4th and 5th Street across from Boatyard Bar and Grill, but it takes up that whole block. And so if you are driving across the bridge into Eastport, you make the left turn at Severn. The entrance to that lot is on your left. So you've turned from 6th onto Severn, you pass the school on your right, the elementary school, and then the entrance is the middle of the next block on your left. One of the reasons that lot is not well utilized is the first thing you see as you slow down to make the turn to go into that lot is an attendant booth and parking gates. But what most people don't know is that off hours, like if you want to go to Carroll's Creek for dinner, that booth isn't manned, and you take a ticket to get the gate to go up, but you don't have to pay. So people don't understand when that lot is free and when it's not.
Carroll's Creek, and then I know Morgan Stanley is in there. They validate.
Right. And so so that lot is one that could use some innovation in terms of payment and capacity management. And another out of the box kind of a thing that we have to think about is, I'll give you an example, the Tecumseh condominium complex. They have a lot across the street that I walk my dogs past there often. I hardly ever see that lot full. Shouldn't there be a mechanism if you live in those condos and you're heading off on a 2 or 3 week trip somewhere, right? And you're not going to be around, and you're taking a road trip, right? Shouldn't you be able, with an app, to offer that spot via an app to someone who might want to pay you for it, to park there for an afternoon or something like that? In other
You're
words,
suggesting an app that will integrate all parking, public and private.
I think where we're headed is we're starting to finally understand that space on our roads and our parking spaces are very expensive assets.
Yep.
And that we have taken them for granted because, the way we're bombarded with car ads, the car ads basically tell us the road is free. The road is not free. The road has never been free. Roads and parking are very costly to provide, but we don't expose ourselves to the costs. So now I think we're starting to finally realize that, and I think that's where Bill's working group will ultimately come out. They'll start to realize, wow, parking is a really valuable asset. And when you have valuable assets, Tara, being a finance person, you understand this. When you have valuable assets, you have to manage them carefully and get the most out of them. So
that's such an important point. There's a mindset that car transportation is somehow free. The roads are free, and
yes.
But public transit we have to charge a
So
cost
yeah,
for
one
it.
of
This
one of
is
the worst
kind of
one of the worst
upside
days
down.
in history. One of the worst days in American history for our environment was the day the word freeway was coined back in the late
Yes.
40s, early 50s. It was brilliant marketing, but it's a very destructive idea.
Great. Thank you, David. Carol Kelly.
I just have some quick points to make that are the result of my riding the bus much more frequently than I did during the pandemic, which was absolutely not at all. And I'm observing some things that I think are relevant to two areas of discussion in this meeting. The fare-free discussion is really important right now, and so is the cooperation with Anne Arundel County. And also in tonight's discussion, the really just sort of toying with the idea of how routes could be changed to expand, of course, but also to go after special groups that will be more likely to use the bus than other groups in town. So that would take some creative designing to put the buses some places and not put them other places. I want to speak specifically to Kwaku and to the Alderwoman because I think it's the time for changes to be initiated. For instance, Kwaku, I ride the green bus now, and I am frequently the only rider on the green bus, which goes down West Street twice an hour, all times of the day. And I may not be riding it at busy times, although a couple of times I have, and it hasn't been crowded. I was one of the people outraged a few years ago when that route was switched to once an hour on Saturdays. Well, I'm not outraged anymore. I mean, I think with some creative, and again, as I say, designing, this bus system could be used not in a customized way, but it could be used in a way that's much more geared to the people who are using it, because they're certainly not storming the buses yet, despite our efforts to get people out of their cars and onto buses. And you know how dear that matter is to me. This morning, just to give this an example, I almost coincidentally, I ride both the county bus and I ride the county bus from Parole Town Center to the mall where I catch the city bus. And I've been doing that during the week on the city buses. And coincidentally, a county bus came first. I know it comes by, and it was windy and cold. So I hopped on the county bus and got to, and didn't have to pay anything, and got to the green bus and had to put in my $2. But it was the timing was different. It made a faster trip. I caught an earlier green bus. I didn't have to sit around in the the windy stand booth at the mall. So it's the time for it's a time for taking the dreams and the maybe impossible scenarios of design for this system to the drawing board, I think, and to the budget. And especially because the comprehensive plan is still in the works. So that's all.
Let me add this. One of the concepts that we have been discussing is a hybrid system where during the morning and evening peak hours, we will have both the fixed route and what is called a micro transit. Micro transit normally will be smaller vehicles going to the neighborhoods where we have very few people who would like to use the transit, and that brings them to the closest bus stop, and then they will continue their trip on the fixed route. And then during the off-peak periods where we don't expect many people to ride, we will ride we will have only the micro transit, which basically you have to request a trip. It's kind of a general on-demand service.
Yes.
The county calls is Call a Ride. Here we are thinking of using an app that you can actually request the trip through the app, giving an idea when the bus is coming. So that is moving forward for our next, what you call Transit Development Plan update, is to explore that concepts and how we can make it more practical. If you do recall, Alderwoman Tyranny did sponsor an amendment in the current fiscal year budget for $90,000 to use as a pilot project. We have put on we have put that pilot project on hold because VIA, which is a subcontractor for AMRP, the company that is building the garage, is doing exactly the same thing with respect to the reconstruction of the Hilma parking garage. So once that is over, you'll be able to basically do our pilot project, and that will determine where the demand is. So that is where we see this going. In fact, Montgomery County government actually did set money aside to buy brand new, smaller vehicles for their micro transit service. So it's something, especially when we embark on the update, the Public Advisory Committee may want to make a strong recommendation to look into that. And not only that, in terms of funding, the sad thing about our TDP, that's the Transit Development Plan, is that it has a lot of recommendations that requires cities' investment in the public transit system. That had not happened. It's always go for grants. Grants are limited. It's competitive. We do the best we can. But those communities that really see transit in a different light actually do invest in the transit system. So that's what I'm hoping.
They could invest in an assistant for you. They could invest in an assistant for you who would do this kind of designing and rethinking. I mean, something of this scale that would be such a shift, such a sea change, doesn't just come by switching the green for once an hour from twice an hour. That's great. That's good to hear. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Kurt, you're muted.
Thank you so much. Gosh. Yeah, thanks so much for your remarks, not only on vehicles, but on system redesign. I had a thought that is, after speaking with Karma, that system redesign is really, really important. If I got this correctly, you have to walk a mile and a half to reach the bus. Is that right? Some of these are defects of city route design, and some of them have nothing to do with the city. There is a bus stop within 100 yards of where you live, Karma, and you can't reach it because there's private property and a fence which stands in the way. So we have odd little problems. Annapolis, if you get on a bicycle and ride around Annapolis, you quickly discover that we are a highly balkanized city. There are neighborhoods that are walled off from other neighborhoods, and this is a characteristic of our town all over the place. There are fences. You cannot get, if you want to go 100 yards, you can't. You have to go a mile. And this is the sort of design problem which generates traffic. One of the things I think would bear looking into is some way of de-balkanizing our neighborhoods so that at least pedestrians and bicycles can get through these fences, if not automobiles. But I'll leave that thought with you for the future. All right, last but not least, and I'm trying to change this list around so that you're not always in the same order, is Vince Harriman.
I don't have anything to add, but I realized that I've missed 2 meetings due to work and travel, so I apologize to the board. I'm traveling again, but I'm mostly back and in better control of my schedule now. So,
well, congratulations. Okay. If there is nothing else, we've gone slightly over time. Thank you all for participating, and we will see you next time.